Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of What's on the Horizon. I'm Lori Sharonbrock, and I'm here with Chris Schucker of Digital Horizons. And we had an interesting topic come up when we were talking about buyer's remorse. And it's kind of an opposite concept when it comes to home technology.
Right. Yeah. So in this case, the buyer's remorse isn't like a typical, like, I regret buying it. It's I regret not doing something. Mm-hmm. So we had a client that built a home, and again, this happens a lot. And during the process, there's some things that are common in homes that we provide, or areas of a home that we'll put stuff into. And sometimes it just doesn't work out. Either they don't see the value in it initially, they don't think they'll use it, or the budget just isn't there, which is very common. Yeah. In fact, it's kind of a side topic, but something that comes up a lot that I talk to clients about is we're very open that we understand that nobody needs anything that we offer, right? Sure. It's not a necessity. There's an argument to be made maybe about networking and Wi-Fi and things like that in today's day and age. You would need those things, but it's not a necessity. You could live without anything that we offer. So we like to point out that, like, we know you want what we have. We want to work under those circumstances and make sure it meets your needs, meets your budget and everything else. But back to the main thing. So in this most recent project, we recommended something to be added to the house. It didn't work out. It didn't get added. But now they're back, a year and a half later saying, hey, we know we realize you recommended this. Now we want it. And it's the downside is it's often much harder to add certain things to a home after the fact, of course, depending on what it is. So it was something I wanted to bring up because if you're working with somebody in our industry and there's something that maybe you want to take out for whatever reason, it's always our recommendation to do the rough-in portion. At least. Because there's a lot of ways to do the rough-in portion in a manner that preserves the ability to come back to it at a later date. Sure. So if you were to do, let's say you're taking a TV out, for example, maybe in a guest bedroom or something like that, and you don't want to do the TV, just put the wiring in now. With our low voltage wiring, it's something that can actually be buried in the wall. It can be buried, sheetrocked over, covered up, and there's lots of ways of documenting where it's at to get to it later. Sure. The challenging part with a TV is you obviously need power for a television, and without doing something different, the electrician can't bury their wires because there has to be a terminating end per code. Yeah. But there's ways that they could wire it so that it could be accessed later. If it's an interior wall, it could go through an outlet down below and then be extended up at a later date. But in the case of speakers, for example, which is often something that gets scaled back, if something does get scaled back, there's, again, ways of wiring for speakers, both in ceiling or on the outside of a home. That can be done and then dug out essentially later at a later date. And that's really the hardest thing to add later if somebody wants to put speakers in areas where if there isn't wiring, it can often be very difficult to get wiring to, or if it can be done, it's very costly, especially if it's on the outside of a home and maybe there's no attic access, or even on the interior of the house if it's on a lower level, and maybe there's, depending on how the home was built, if there's I-beams versus like an open web truss floor system or something like that, it can be very difficult to run wires. So the topic of buyer's remorse isn't so much like I regret buying anything, just I regret not buying it because later on it can be very difficult to add without some preparation. So my input would be try to get the rough-in done, try to include that, document it properly by taking measurements, using landmarks, taking photos, things like that. And then when you come back to it at a later date, it's a lot easier to add than not.
And I would imagine, not that much more costly. Like, you still kind of probably end up in an added cost in the end. But if you can rough in, that probably saves some of that dollars. And then you're just putting the equipment back again.
Correct. There's a lot of efficiencies when, if we do everything at once, of course. Whereas if we have to come back later, like say, for example, if we bury the wire, well, now we have to cut a hole in the ceiling and we have to clean that mess up, which it's not a big deal, but it adds a little bit, but it's not significant.
Right.
But if that wire is not there, then it's either worst case scenario, it's not possible, or it's
really expensive.
Exactly. It adds a lot of cost.
Is there anything in your mind? And you said earlier, like, obviously these are wants and not necessarily needs.
Yeah.
But is there something you shouldn't skimp on if you're going to do? Is there like, no, you should do this all at once because this is really important?
It's hard to say because every project is different. I wouldn't say there's a set in stone thing that should be done. But if there's areas of things that you're wanting to remove and there, zones of speakers and things like that, just do the wiring. It's such a minimal cost up front compared to having the total cost of putting speakers in. Obviously there's a lot of things involved because you have the rough-in materials, you have the speakers, you have you have to have a necessary amount of amplifier channels and things like that. And scaling back a pair of speakers can be a lot of savings because of other things that get cascaded in that are required. But if you can just at least do the rough-in and have the wiring there, let's say you cut out 4 pairs of speakers, right? But you still wire for 4, but and then in the next 10 years you only add in 2 again.
Sure.
You've saved so much money by not cutting out the wiring as well.
Sure. Like it's easier to cut that hole than to rip an entire wall of sheetrock out and have to redo
lots of patches and things like that.
Yes, and it just looks more seamless.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, that in a way it's like a fear of missing out, and then there's buyer's remorse. So when someone brings you in for that consultation, how do they start that process, and how does that conversation go?
They just call us. We have a contact form on our website. They can shoot us an email, or they can reach us by phone at 218-330-4140, and just, hey, we're building a house, we're doing a remodel, and just start the conversation. Come in here and we can discuss what's possible.
Yes, come into this space and see what's possible. Really awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time on What's on the Horizon.